The men who designed the modern world and never faced a ballot. No campaign posters, no debates, no crowds chanting their names. Yet the world you live in, the borders you recognize, the money you use, the crises you inherit, were shaped by men you never voted for. They did not stand behind podiums, they stood behind doors. They were not elected, they were installed, by expertise, by access, by necessity. This is not a story about conspiracy. It is a story about structure, about how power learned it didn't need permission. Democracy was never designed for speed. It was designed for legitimacy. Votes take time. Debate takes time. Consensus is slow, especially when fear is high. The 20th century brought crises that moved faster than public opinion could form. World wars, economic collapses, empires dissolving overnight. In these moments, governments began to improvise. They paused process without admitting it. They deferred decisions to those who understood the problem. Economists replaced legislators. Planners replaced parliaments. Advisors replaced voters. Not because democracy failed, but because it hesitated. And in hesitation, power found new hands. Money does not rule through force. It rules through gravity. Central bankers do not pass laws, they alter conditions. Raise interest rates and entire industries slow. Lower them and bubbles inflate quietly. These decisions shape housing, employment, debt, and survival, yet they are rarely subject to public approval. Institutions like the Federal Reserve, the IMF, and the World Bank were framed as stabilizers, neutral referees in a chaotic world. But neutrality is a myth when outcomes are uneven. Austerity feels different depending on which side of the balance sheet you're on. Stability protects creditors before workers. Inflation punishes savers more than debtors. These were political outcomes, disguised as technical adjustments. And once finance learned it could steer nations without elections, there was no reason to stop. Maps look permanent, but most borders are improvisations, frozen in ink. After global wars, planners faced impossible timelines. Empires were collapsing faster than replacements could be imagined, so borders were drawn quickly, often by men who would never live inside them. Ethnic groups were merged, rivalries ignored, historical fault lines papered over with straight edges and signatures. The goal was not harmony, it was control, stability for the moment, containment of enemies, prevention of future wars, at least the next one. These planners didn't face voters in the Middle East, or the Balkans, or Africa. They faced pressure from other planners, and the consequences, delayed, compounded, explosive, became someone else's problem. Intelligence agencies operate in darkness for a reason. Information loses value once it's shared. But secrecy has a cost. Operations were justified as protection, as prevention, as necessity. Governments were destabilized without declarations, leaders removed without public knowledge, movements funded, armed, or destroyed quietly, all in the name of defending democracy. The irony was never lost, it was simply ignored. These decisions were made by men whose names would never appear on ballots, and when plans failed, there were no voters to answer to. Only silence, only classification stamps, only history rewritten as success or omission. Some men didn't rule governments, they ruled dependents. Railroads that determined migration, oil companies that decided wars, telecommunications firms that controlled information flow. At a certain scale, corporations stop being businesses. They become systems nations cannot function without. Governments negotiate with them, not regulate them. Policies bend to their logistics. Wars are planned around their capacity. Industrialists never needed to campaign. They controlled what states needed to survive. You don't vote against electricity. You don't challenge the steel supply during wartime. You don't nationalize everything without consequences. Power settled where necessity lived. Eventually, unelected power learned how to make itself untouchable. Not through force, through language. Decisions were framed as best practices, outcomes described as inevitable, failures labeled unfortunate externalities. Expertise replaced ideology. If something worked, it was proof of correctness. If it failed, the model was adjusted, never questioned. This was authority without accountability. You can argue with a politician. You can protest a law. But how do you protest an algorithm? How do you vote against a forecast? The more complex systems became, the fewer people felt qualified to challenge them, and power prefers silence to opposition. Here's the truth that unsettles most people. These men were not imposed. They were invited. Democracies surrendered authority because crises demanded answers faster than elections could provide. People wanted stability, certainty, results. When fear dominates, process feels like a luxury. So responsibility was outsourced. Decisions were deferred. Oversight quietly relaxed. Each handoff felt temporary. Each exception felt reasonable, until exception became norm. The result is a world governed by systems few understand, but everyone depends on. Markets that crash without warning. Borders that bleed without resolution. Institutions too large to fail and too distant to trust. When things break, accountability dissolves. The architects are gone, the institutions remain. No elections lost, no apologies issued, just continuity. The men who designed the modern world rarely left signatures. They didn't need monuments. They didn't need approval. Their work lives on in interest rates, borders, institutions, and systems that still decide who prospers and who pays the price. They are gone, but their designs remain. And that raises a question worth sitting with. If power no longer asks for permission, who is watching it now? History doesn't end, it accumulates. And every generation inherits a world shaped by decisions they never voted on and rarely understood at the time. That is why this ledger exists. If you believe history should be examined, not celebrated, if you believe power should be traced, not assumed, then subscribe, turn on notifications, because the next chapter is already being written, quietly, deliberately, and without a ballot. And here at the Dusty Ledger, we keep the record. The ledger remains open.